Hello, I'm Alex McLaren. I'm an actor and I've worked as a communications coach since 2002. Now so much business is being conducted remotely, the ways in which we talk, present, build relationships and connect is changing. In this podcast, I want to explore all those issues and prove to you that no matter who you are, you can talk to anyone. Hello and welcome to You Can Talk to Anyone, the podcast where we open the bonnet on our communications engine. I'm Alex McLaren.
And I'm Tom Zielinski.
And this week, I am inspired by some work I've been doing with clients. And I wanted to talk about, well, it's really what we talk about and whether we have a right to talk about it. I want to talk about privacy and confidentiality.
There is a sort of understanding, isn't there, with people like us, that it's sort of therapy rules. You know, what happens inside these sessions doesn't leave it.
Yes, absolutely it does. But even that comes with some difficulties, because if you wanted to make many years' experience as a therapist available to other therapists, for example, you'd have to talk about stuff. And so in order to do that, you need to find a safe and ethical way of sharing those stories with other people. And typically what one would do would you change the names to protect the innocent, and you'd find ways of anonymizing the stories that you're telling in a way that ideally would mean that the individual from whom you learned that stuff was unidentifiable. But even that can be a little bit anxiety-inducing, I think.
Yeah.
But I'm just thinking about kind of what it's all really about. I mean, because when we're, even it's not a therapeutic relationship, but we're in particularly with clients, I'd say, but still they are reasonably anxious about sharing their problems effectively with somebody from outside their organization, and then that becoming a story that escapes. It's been I've got a long history with this, really. I mean, I think back to my when I was first embarking on professional life, I guess. I had a friend of mine who this is interesting. I wonder if I could even tell this story, Tom, even if I don't write it. Okay, I have.
You can swear our listeners to silence.
Okay, right, don't tell anybody.
As Deborah said once, a secret is merely something you tell one person at a time.
True. Okay, so let me see if I can say this in a way which kind of reflects the way this might be told to me by somebody else. If you want to become a professional security services member, you need to be security vetted.
Yeah.
So what they do is they would send out another member of the security services to talk to people that know you. And they will ask you questions. And I was on the receiving end of one of those engagements in written form. And so one of the...
So you know what's going on. This isn't being... It's not like you suddenly strike up a particularly chirpy conversation with somebody sitting on the next table at a cafe.
Yeah.
You're told this is going to happen. You're told what it's about.
Well, so this is really interesting. You are having to pin this down for the listeners because I'm anxious about what I can and can't say. It means that I am not talking very clearly. Do you hear what it's kind of? I'm trying to work out what I can't say. So I suppose if I was to be a bit more specific without giving anything away, somebody I knew was joining a government department, and as part of their application process, I received a missive from that department saying, "We'd like you to answer these questions," and I then filled in a questionnaire.
The question presumably is so-and-so a rotter?
Is he
or a wrong-un?
What is this? He or she? Is he or she a bounder? And again, yes. In order to kind of to reduce the identifiable nature of the individual concerned, I'm trying to make this as general as possible by not even sharing this person's gender with you.
No, but in my imagined sort of 1930s version, obviously it would all be chaps.
Of course, yeah.
Where one chap asking another chap whether a third chap is a wrong 'un.
That's right. So imagine I show up at Lion's Corner House in my Homburg. No, basically, I sit down and jot this in. I had another friend of mine who did have a face-to-face interview with on behalf of this third party, but I was just doing it in written form. But again, one of the things which I was bringing up was, I guess, the ability of this person. It seemed relevant. to feel trustworthy, and there's obviously friends do feel trustworthy. If I disclose a kind of an embarrassing vulnerability to you, Tom, you're not going to tell the listeners on this podcast, or rather, well, you might, Tom, because it was a good story. But there is that sense among people that we trust, people that we talk to, is that they will listen to us and not then go away and say, guess what, and tell crowds of people. And we think of that as just a generally positive quality, but then it can make people feel boring if they then don't have things that they know which are really interesting. If they involve somebody else, they then can't share that. And I think that's one of the really serious problems for people at work, because there are things that about your own organization, which might be commercially sensitive, or there might be, if you're a consultant of some kind, things that you've signed a confidentiality paper. There are some of, there are clients I know, and I can say this, there are clients whose confidentiality NDAs I have signed, which are so secret that I cannot reveal that I have signed an NDA with that client. Or even that the NDA exists. And in fact, at one end of the scale, that can cause very, very serious problems. I'm thinking, for example, in the era of Me Too, that the NDAs in the film business have started to look extremely fragile. Likewise, NDAs in finance. There's a sense in which that level of privacy actually ends up being a source of bad press for the organization, because actually we, as well as wanting to trust people to keep secrets, we also want the people we engage with to be open. And that's the same for organizations. I'd say that feels like a positive quality, even though a corporation is not a person.
In theory, once you have this agreement that what is said in this room goes no further, what you should have is within that room a greater degree of openness. But you're right, it's when that conversation needs to escape from those walls. So, for example, sometimes what will happen is we're running a session with a bunch of people and they're being incredibly open and honest and vulnerable and telling us about their fears and anxieties, and we're coaching them and trying to suggest some strategies which might be going to work. Everyone has a wonderful time, goes away with some new things to try. And then the person who booked us says, Tom, Alex, how did you get on? We're now expected to report back.
Yes. And in fact, usually when those questions are asked, I'm thinking, so if you are someone who habitually works with me and Tom, this is what happens when you make that call. And I know that I say this to you, actually, so I know you understand it. I'm simply checking in with you that your people are normal and that there's nothing terribly awful going on. I know that there are, in therapeutic circumstances, there are almost like legal things that somebody in a position of responsibility has to then go and disclose. So, for example, and I suppose I should reassure you all that if I hear that somebody's committed a murder, I won't keep stum on that in order to look after people's confidentiality. But I also think that one of the things I say is that it needs to be a safe space for people to be honest about their vulnerabilities. And so in a way that my client isn't necessarily squadcast.com, for example, the organization that produced this podcasting platform that Tom and I are using. My client is Jane and Terry, the two people in the room who Squadcast have sent to work with us. And that's because in order to make progress with all of this stuff, we need to be honest about the confidence challenges that people face. It's funny, there is there can in that conversation be a weird kind of power dynamic. I recently watched for the first time ever Top Gun, Tom, which I know that you did on another podcast recently. And one of the lines in that is somebody's talking to somebody about some piece of military technology, and I think it's Tom Cruise says, "If I told you, I'd have to kill you," and which may even be the origin of that phrase, which kind of is in general circulation as a joke. And so there is sometimes, I think, the way in which people use privacy almost as a sort of as a means of claiming sort of access to secret knowledge as a sort of power gambit in interaction, and that's interesting as well, particularly among people who are supposed to trust each other. I've been in Shakespeare. There are two conversations between husbands and wives. In Julius Caesar, Portia comes in and has a go at Brutus for not telling her what's going on. Because obviously he's involved in an extremely dangerous political conspiracy and he doesn't want to tell her. And the same thing happens. It's exactly the same situation, actually, in Henry IV. Lady Percy has this fantastic argument with her husband Hotspur because he's involved in a rebellion, and she says, "Why don't you trust me?" And that's quite interesting, that there are people to whom the rules of secrets don't apply. They're pillow talk. Means that anything I tell you, Deborah has access to, and that's fine. but we trust each other to know where those lines are.
And of course, it's one way of establishing trust to say, I wouldn't tell this to everybody. This is not widely known.
Yeah.
But I can trust you with this information, so here it is.
Yes. It's funny. I think that's... and certainly you need to kind of preface it. You need to kind of almost like... You need to almost make explicit deals with people that the conversation has led you into an important enough area to dance with this sort of this no man's land in a way. But I think there are also circumstances in which that can be... So does this ever happen to you? That someone that you don't know particularly well is gossiping so openly about a third party that it tells you something about that you might be material for a conversation with others. So in disclosing things to other people, we open up sort of almost like a back and forth. It makes it safe for them to speak to us. But we're almost making a mutual tacit deal that it won't then just become stuff that they go on and tell to other people, with the possible exceptions of their life partners.
Well, there's a difference, I think, isn't there, between someone who is idly chattering away and tossing out for general social amusement all sorts of personal information about people that the person being spoken to may or may not know, and someone who says with much more gravitas and solemnity, it's important that you should know this. And I think that to me would make a big difference in terms of how much I trust this person. Does this person pass on other people's secrets gaily and insouciantly, without regard, or do they impress upon me how secret and confidential this information is and how carefully, therefore, I must guard it?
Yes.
And I would be much more willing to tell my secrets to the second person than the first person.
Yes, and I think it ties up with my old theme about what's your motivation being the most important question in the universe, both in life as in show business. That if I feel the reason you're sharing a confidence with me is an important one rather than a trivial one, then that gives you a little bit more latitude for pinning things down. It also, I guess, it establishes a sort of a just cause for breaking the general rules of not washing other people's dirty linen in public.
Yeah. And for example, I have a wonderful story which, if gently pushed, I will tell about an agent. And in this story, this agent comes off very badly. There are two occasions which I'll tell this story. One is just sort of generally to amuse, because we're swapping horror stories about agents, or we're talking about the comedy and entertainment world in general. And if that's the case, I will tell the story and be scrupulous about not naming the agent in question.
Yes.
Or providing any identifying information at all. However, there's another occasion at which I will tell that story, and that is if that agent's name is mentioned by someone else. which case I will say, well, here's something you possibly should know. I don't know if it's true, but it does sound true, and here it is.
Yeah, it's
Would you like to hear the story?
I very much would like to hear the story. If it's possible to tell it, Tom, on a podcast without feeling that you're breaking
I think it is.
all sorts of rules.
Yeah. I will be scrupulous about not naming the agent.
I'd like to point out to our listeners that by having this preambular conversation with Tom, he has bought himself the right to tell the story. He clearly cares so much about it.
You give me a name, and I will use that name to refer to this agent.
Bobby.
All right. So Bobby had a reputation for hanging around at comedy clubs and just signing up usually young male comedians fairly kind of enthusiastically without a lot of regard for quality control, but just on the hope that if enough of them were signed to the agency, that one or two of them might make it big, and that would make it worthwhile. And very often after a year or two, if these young comedians weren't breaking through, they would just get an email saying, I'm sorry, we can't represent you any longer. So Bobby is at a comedy club doing the thing that Bobby does, and a comedian who's had quite a good night comes off the stage, and Bobby comes up to him and says, I really enjoyed your show. I'm Bobby, I'm an agent. Do you have representation at the moment? And the comedian looks at Bobby and says, yes, actually, Bobby, I do. It's you.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
I hope it's not. I genuinely hope that I haven't accidentally given you a name, which is actually this agent's name. Because if you're in the comedy business, your agent's name is Bobby, everyone will be nodding and go, "Yeah, that's definitely him."
But this is the power of stories,
exactly.
isn't it? This is the power that they have. And it's why gossip is so delicious. And generally speaking, especially when it comes to kind of relationship stuff, I'm the ideal person to tell gossip to because I don't care, I don't remember. So the person who needs to unburden themselves of the information can do so, secure the knowledge that I won't be the one who spreads it any further.
Yeah.
But a story like that is too good not to pass on. Like I said, it may not be true. It may not be true at all, but people who know Bobby will be going, yeah, I can believe that.
Yeah. It's not such a killer story. It's not kind of like everybody quits with Bobby's story. It's kind of, and in fact, were I Bobby, that's the kind of story that I would be telling myself at dinner parties because it's something that everybody dreads happening to them, and they would really enjoy it if I told it against myself. Yeah. No, the other thing that's curious is that when we sort of, and I've noticed this particularly when working with people or business, is that when you do go, hang on, right, okay, I've worked out a way of telling this story without breaking all the rules of privacy, is that people anonymize stuff and they put in alternative names. They make a kind of a grey Twitter avatar egg out of our central character. And if you do that, it's amazing. It doesn't necessarily make it less it doesn't make it safer, because sometimes it can just make your listeners go, oh my God, I really need to know who is the real firm, who is the real person that you slot into that. Or worse, they start thinking, oh, I think it's this person. They can speculate, and I think that's one reason why you see. I'm thinking of a recent example is in Parliament this week. This is sort of late May. There has been an unnamed MP who has been, I think, is it cautioned, Tom, or actually arrested for some kind of crime. And of course, the political Twitterverse then goes crazy trying to kind of to fill in the name.
Only 650 other blighters.
Yeah, indeed.
It's a relatively small pool of people to start investigating.
Indeed, and currently quite a high level of criminality among them, at least in terms of my life. Yeah. I suppose I'm curious because there's a very good reason, genuinely a good reason for not gossiping and not telling stories out of school, which is to prove that you're trustworthy, and in order to enable other people to be honest without feeling that you're going to exploit what happens to them. And then the downside of that is that it means that people can become like a clam, or worse, feel boring, because they're so used to speaking in generalities or in abstracts rather than telling specific stories, that they don't really understand that their experiences are riveting to other people and that their own stories are well worth sharing. And I think thinking about that and trying to and practicing ways of doing it safely is a sure way of building your own confidence when you're thinking about your engagements, particularly with new people and making new connections with people. Give yourself permission to tell stories and find ways of telling them safely. And in order for other people to join in that interaction with you, because trust me, my own experiences are just my experiences. I am much more interested in everybody else's, and that is true of them as well. Thank you so much for joining us today. Tom and I do all kinds of very confidential work with clients, so please do get in touch with us if you want to work with us on any kind of face-to-face communication. I'm at alex@the-spontaneity-shop.com.
And I'm Tom at the-spontaneity-shop.com or at Tom Selinsky on Twitter.
Please do get in touch with us if there are things you'd like us to cover on this podcast. And thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.
Cheerio.
You have been listening to You Can Talk to Anyone with Alex McLaren and Tom Selinsky. The producer for The Spontaneity Shop was Tom Selinsky. You Can Talk to Anyone is distributed exclusively by Acast.